Please be seated. Wherever your treasure is, your heart will be also. When I began preparing for today's sermon, after I heard that I would have the honor of preaching today, as most 21st seminarians do, I Googled heavenly treasures. And right away, a website called heavenlytreasures.com popped up. And I thought, this is great. This is going to be so easy. And I was very excited. But when I clicked on the link, my excitement quickly turned to disappointment when I saw that it was a site selling fine jewelry. How ironic. And yet, I guess I wasn't really all that surprised by the notion of heavenly treasure being used in an ad campaign to sell earthly treasure. When I was a little girl, my grandma Irene, who was my mama's mama, used to tell her grandchildren when they were asked to do some kindness they were not inclined to do, or a favor for someone, or to make nice with someone who wasn't very nice, that they would earn another jewel in their heavenly crowns. Now, I took my grandma Irene very seriously, and quite literally. And I used to wonder what my crown would look like when I got to heaven. I imagined it might be like one of those tall golden crowns like they wore in the Middle Ages, encrusted with pearls and gleaming jewels. I wondered if all the other people up there in heaven would be impressed with my crown and notice how holy I was. Today's gospel lesson comes from Matthew's account of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. In it, Jesus teaches his disciples and followers how to live their lives. He speaks of metanoia, which is a Greek word that means change of life. Jesus tells us how to pray, how to fast, and how to give alms. These are spiritual practices we still continue to this day, and especially during the Lenten season. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus also talks about what our priorities ought to be. He urges us to prioritize the things of heaven, the things of God, over the things of the earth, which are passing. When Jesus talks about heavenly treasure, I think he's talking about our relationship with God and with our neighbors. Everything else you see is perishable. The relationships we have with God and our neighbors aren't subject to rust or moths or thieves. In the context of Matthew's gospel, heavenly treasure is another way of talking about serving God. Just a few verses after the one Father Gary just read for us, Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now, I remember when I was in middle school, I heard about the shocking story of the assassination of the Roman Catholic Archbishop in El Salvador. Maybe you recall hearing that story too. Oscar Romero was the Archbishop of San Salvador from 1977 until his untimely death in 1980. Although he came from a modest family, he was able to attend seminary and eventually was sent to Rome to study theology. After his ordination to the priesthood, he returned home to his hometown of San Miguel, where he worked among the poor and served as an administrator for the church. Now, Romero had the reputation of being a company man. He was conservative, siding with the government and the church on many issues. On more than one occasion, he showed himself to be skeptical of the reforms of Vatican II and the subsequent pronouncements that came from the Council of Latin American Bishops in Medellin, Colombia, in 1968. Those bishops resolved to abandon the church's hierarchical tradition as defender of the status quo and to side instead with the poor in their struggle for social justice. These changes divided the church. And for this reason, When Oscar Romero was appointed to Archbishop in 1977, it was not well received among those socially committed clergy and lay leaders who saw his appointment as a sign of the Vatican's disapproval. Much to their surprise, however, the new Archbishop turned out to be an outspoken opponent of injustice and a defender of the poor. In 1977, shortly after his appointment, one of his closest friends, Father Rutilio Grande, who was a progressive Jesuit priest, was assassinated along with a poor farmer and the farmer's young son. This was a turning point for Archbishop Romero, and soon after Rutilio's death, he began protesting the government's injustice to the poor and its policies of torture. To that end, he met with Pope John Paul II in 1980 about the Salvadoran government's engagement in terror and assassination. He also wrote to the American government asking them to stop military aid to El Salvador, but his request was ignored. Oscar Romero's commitment to the gospel led to numerous conflicts, both with the government of El Salvador and within the Catholic Church. Increasing government violence against socially committed priests and laypersons undermined Romero's trust in the goodwill of the authorities and led him to fear that the church and religion itself was under attack. Some people have criticized Oscar Romero for being a communist, for being too politically involved, but it's really clear, based on an examination of his sermons, in his life, in his ultimate martyrdom, that what motivated him was not economic politics or government power, but rather the gospel of Jesus Christ. As he spoke out more and more over the following months, the Archbishop gathered an ever-increasing popular following. People crowded into the cathedral to hear him preach and tuned into his sermons that were broadcast over the Archdiocese radio station. He used this radio broadcast to great effect, denouncing both the violence of the Civil War and the deeply rooted patterns of oppression and injustice which bred it. In a country whose rulers regarded dissent as subversion, Romero used the moral authority of his position to speak out on behalf of those who could not do so for themselves, earning the nickname, the voice of the voiceless. Romero's campaign for human rights in El Salvador won him national and international admirers, as well as a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. And it also won him some enemies. On the morning of March 24th, 1980, an assassin at the command of the Salvadoran government's death squad pulled up in front of the open doors of the Church of the Divine Providence, set up a tripod on the roof of the vehicle, and fired a machine gun at Archbishop Romero as he was celebrating Mass. I had the opportunity to travel to El Salvador 2 summers ago with a program offered by Cristosal, and the students that I was with and I were allowed to go behind the altar where Archbishop Romero was assassinated, which isn't usually allowed, and I think it was. I feel really fortunate to have had that opportunity. But to see the view that he must have seen, knowing that he was surrendering his life for the gospel, was very moving and changed my heart. The Archbishop had been aware his life was in danger and had spoken of it often, declaring his willingness to accept martyrdom if his blood might contribute to the solution of the nation's problems. The day before he was martyred, you see, he had preached a sermon calling on soldiers to disobey any order that violated human rights. He told them, "A bishop will die, but the Church of God, which is the people, will never perish." The Roman Catholic Church beatified Oscar Romero on May 23rd of 2015, declaring him a servant of God. He's honored as a martyr by many Christian denominations around the world, including the Episcopal Church and the Church of England, where his statue, along with those of Martin Luther King Jr., Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and 7 other saints of the 20th century, adorns the west entrance of Westminster Abbey. For me, the life of Oscar Romero serves as a powerful and moving example of what it means to store up treasures in heaven. Perhaps during this Lenten season, we might consider what our heavenly treasures are. The good news is that whatever your heavenly treasures are, neither moth nor rust consume them, and thieves cannot break in and steal them. Wherever your treasure is, your heart will be also. Amen.